Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Carl Hauge. Hello there. You know some of those radio quiz programs? The question is asked, what's the greatest noise ever heard by man? And some of the uniformed answers say the blast of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, or the crash of an Arctic glacier breaking into the sea, or the explosions of a munitions plant. But they never win a washing machine with those answers for the greatest noise ever heard by man, and there doesn't seem to be even a close competitor for the honor. The greatest noise was the eruption of Krakatoa of the Dutch East Indies that blew up with a frightful loss of lives and shook the whole continent of Asia with its violence. What does that have to do with us? Well, a one-time neighbor of ours stood at the rails of a ship and witnessed the whole awesome spectacle. And he carried this sight with him to his last days as the most awful thing he had ever seen. But that was not the only claim to a page in our scrapbook that Carl Hauge had. He had climbed Chilliwack Pass with the gold seekers and sailed the waters of the earth since he was old enough to have a use in seafaring ways. And for more than 40 years, he called Grays Harbor home. So when Dick had said a few words from our sponsor, we'll be back to tell you about Carl Hauge, a longtime Grays Harborite who saw with his own eyes the mightiest explosion ever seen by man. Now first, Dick Crombie and a few words from our sponsor. Most of you will recall Carl Hauge. He operated a cleaning shop in Hoquiam and Aberdeen over more than 40 years. He owned a home in Aberdeen, raised a family here, and when his 3/4 of a century of work was finished, he retired to the South Beaches to live out the remainder of his life. Carl Hauge began his life work when he was 5. He was one of the many children in a Norwegian family among the fjords of the Northern Islands. At the age of 5, he was taught to man a sweep in his father's boat, to pull nets, to handle fish lines, and he began to do his share. The kid starting young in Norway, and when he was 13 years old, he was old enough to ship before the mast in the ice trade. Sailing ships operated between Norway's frozen lakes and Ireland with 500-ton cargoes of ice. It was a profitable trade, and young Carl put his strong back to the loading and unloading. Best, he beat down sails, lent a hand to the lines, and before he was 15, he was an able seaman. It was in Montreal, after many years at sea, that the young Norwegian man landed and decided to try land for a while. And after a spell of drifting, he wound up in Astoria. It was the Columbia River of the mid-1890s, and the fishing, something that Hauge well understood, was at its best. He went to work for a fisheries company operating their buying and store scows. During the off-season, he took them upriver to fresh water and to shake off barnacles. He recalled it as the life of Riley, and then many of them have been thoughts of young men's minds of settling down at the mouth of the Columbia. But a historic event changed his life. Someone discovered gold in the Klondike, and Carl Hauge, along with thousands of other Americans, headed north to make their stake. He never forgot that first trip. It was in the condemned steamer Oregon in 1898. The Oregon, a rotten derelict, was limited to 60 crew and passengers. But in the heat of the gold rush, she loaded 600 passengers at Astoria and then picked up 400 more from the wrecked ship off Vancouver Island. There was no accommodations, and people crowded the decks all the way to Alaska. With their heavy packs and gears, he climbed Chilliwack Pass and shot the White Horse Rapids. and when he had staked a claim, his first workings indicated gold. A representative of a big mining firm offered him $40,000 for his claim, and after some consideration he refused. A week later, his thin streak of pay dirt faded and disappeared, and in 2 weeks he abandoned the claim as worthless. But he didn't pull out as so many others. He turned to hunting and fur trapping, running a string of traps, and from this made a stake to set him up in business. And the place he selected to open business was Grays Harbor. In 1903, he opened a cleaning plant in Hauge and began to take the spots off Grays Harbor's vest and block the fedoras of the early 20th century. But he did not remain long in business there. Using the volatile cleaning fluids of the long-ago days, he was blown through a plate glass window in the front of his shop one day as a vat of the cleaning fluid exploded. He decided to change his luck, and with A. McCandless, he opened the Grays Harbor Renovatory and Dye Works. The wanderer at last had put his roots down. He was to continue this business for more than 40 years, selling out in 1945 to Warren Cady, son of one of his later partners. Carl Haig's life was long and eventful, but if it had a spectacular highlight, it occurred on the evening of August 26, 1883, when Krakatoa blew its top. Haig was on the Dutch ship, 110 days out of Amsterdam, en route via the Cape of Good Hope, bound for China. The ship made a landfall at Java, head after sightseeing only St. Helens and Madagascar on the entire trip. She had passed Krakatoa on her way through the Sunday Strait between Java and Sumatra, and had squared away through the Java Sea, headed for the straits into the South China Sea. Throughout the day, the ship's company had been apprehensive. The sea was oily glass, and the sky glowed with a jaundiced yellow. The ship was made ready for what they thought would be a tropical storm. Then suddenly, the earth seemed to rumble beneath the water, and all of their eyes fastened on the island of Krakatoa, its smoldering volcano towering above the horizon, 100 miles away. The island exploded with the greatest roar that was ever heard by man. For an instant, as Haig recalled it, things stood still. Then the spiraling column of smoke, dust, and what had been the island soared upward in a climb that could be recorded as 20 miles. Across the waters came a wave of sound that hammered the eardrums. The roar that changed the very air was sound. It vibrated the little ship, and in sympathy the ship rolled, clattered, and squeaked. The sky grew dark. The fading sun bronzed and disappeared after the brief spell, during which hurricane winds whipped across the strait, ashes and sand began, and the rain began to fall onto the decks until it was covered to a depth of 6 inches with the black powder that had been once the island. To Carl J. Haig, who stood there in awe and half fear, it seemed the entire world had exploded. But it was not over. In a rapidly widening circle out from the shore, from the island, came the towering tidal wave, sweeping everything before it. That was to break over the shore of Java and Sumatra and take the lives of thousands of people, destroy cities, plantations, and devastate the coastline. When young Carl did not know was that the roar of that volcano erupting was heard 3,000 miles away. Darkness was to prevail for days in the Dutch lines. Forests were impaired, and dust that had shot out was to mar the terrible explosion, was to float about the earth's upper atmosphere for years to come and be carried all the way to every part of the earth. The little ship was turned into a wave. As the lookout spotted the enormous tidal comber rolling over the sea, it survived the buffeting, only to be wrecked on a coral reef a week later. Haig joined his mates in an open boat and rowed 3 days to an inhabited portion of Java's coast, where he was detained for 6 months by the customs officials in that little litigation between the ship's company and the ship's owner. And there again, Hauge played in for luck. For while thousands were dying of an epidemic of cholera, he managed to avoid the dreaded disease and get back to sea. The story of Carl Hauge skimming off the high adventure and the color of the seafaring days, his mining camp experiences, and his view of Krakatoa is a story of a useful citizen, and its further story of a full lifetime character and a productive laborer, starting to earn his share at the age of 5. As he did, he continued to work until the age of 80, and during the late war years, when help was hard to find, he worked long hours with his partner, W.H. Caddy, operating their cleaning business. In all, he put in a remarkable 75 years of honest toil, which makes it that much more remarkable that he found time to mix his work with pleasure. Many years of adventure on the high sea and a colorful drama of the gold rush experienced that raged from the ice-covered lakes of Norway to the palm-fringed beaches of the South Sea. Carl Hauge left us about 3 years ago, and when we measure what Americans please to call a full life, his is the kind that we can take for a yardstick, for few men who have ever lived amongst us on Grays Harbor have ever packed more into 70 than he did, and none can say that they saw with their own eyes the earth-shaking eruption heard around the world, the explosion of Krakatoa. And now, while Dick Crombie has a word from our sponsor, we'll turn the pages of our hometown scrapbook. The news that friend Billy Warrup brought a carload of bananas in here, including a small model of a boa constrictor as a door prize, harkens back to September 1934, when the German motor ship Harvel berthed here with 1,300 stems of bananas from Costa Rica. Now, Grays Harbor, as most of us are aware, hardly lays claim to being a banana port. That's for Galveston, New Orleans, or Frisco, and the wharfs in those ports take the stems like our longshoremen handle fur. It's second nature. But back in 1934, here came a whole shipload of almost ripe bananas to give Grays Harbor's waterfront workers something of a new trick to think about. The bananas were discharged here under a special permit from the Department of Agriculture, and the hatches were cleared and the winches warmed up and the stevedore companies took over. But as longshoremen doesn't take long to learn a new trick, and the harbor handlers got a hang of it fast, and the stems were pouring out of the holds when one of the lads upped a hank of the fruit and, clutching it with his powerful frame, lugged it to the sling. And when he set it down, one of his partners noticed that he had picked up the traveling mate. It was an oversized tarantula with a life-size growth of beard. The pair of beady eyes of the small black sparrow bill that characterizes the venomous jungle beast, the varmint went out of this world promptly under the stomping boot. But from that moment on, the cargo handlers looked things over before they picked him up all right, and rightly so. For when they had shaken down the cargo, they had littered the deck with tarantulas and done away with what was probably the biggest cargo of bananas ever to come to the harbor, but also the ugliest looking insect cropped ever gleaned from a hold of a ship hereabouts. To top it off, they turned out a small-sized bit of the venomous snake to complete the manifest. The weather saved people from getting hurt, the German skipper allowed. It was cold enough so that the tropical pest couldn't activate, which saved many of the stevedores a swollen arm or leg, and someone a bad time with a jungle snake. And the waterfront men, they had a parcel of fun as they switched from hemlock scantling to bananas, and took the tarantulas and snakes in stride. Thank you for listening.